Hello and welcome to this Vue JS tutorial. The idea of this tutorial is to introduce you to Vue JS. I'm also going to be introducing you to a professional workflow. I'm also going to show you how we can integrate Bootstrap, so Twitter Bootstrap, into Vue JS, and I'm going to show you how we can integrate the Leaflet mapping library into a Vue JS application. So I just very quickly want to talk about Vue JS and its lineage. So Vue JS is a framework. It's fairly new in terms of JavaScript frameworks. It's only been around for 4 years, but it's hugely popular. It's got over 100,000 likes on GitHub, or 100,000 stars rather. So it's hugely popular. It's going places. Vue JS actually, when it was implemented, took the best features of AngularJS at the time and React, both of which are essentially game-changing JavaScript frameworks. So Vue.js took the best bits and put them together, and what we were left with is kind of a hybrid between certain features from Angular, certain features from React, and then we've got Vue.js. The good news though is the concepts are pretty similar. So if you're just new to JavaScript development and specifically developing more complex JavaScript apps, if you learn Vue.js, you can easily use the skills I'm going to teach you in this tutorial and pick up another framework such as React. It's worth noting AngularJS has now become Angular, and Angular is very different from AngularJS. So Angular is for making bigger, wider, more corporate type applications, more enterprise applications. Vue and React are still broadly similar. However, Vue's got some nice features such as directives that we'll look into today, which React doesn't have. So before we go any further, I just want to show you what we're building today. I think it's really important we start with the end result. When I show you what we're building, I really want you to think, how would I do that if I didn't have a library like Vue? So let's just have a quick look at what we're building today. So we're building the Arizona breweries list. So this is actually quite an interesting project because it's currently January and I'm doing dry January, so I thought it might be quite nice to focus at least my programming on alcohol because I won't be drinking any alcohol this month. So let's just very quickly go over what this application does. So first and foremost, it's pulling in breweries from a live API. So this is real data. We're pulling it on from an API, which is free. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is a way for us to interface with third-party data and third-party applications. I just briefly want to show you what this does. So it pulls in data from an API. It displays it in this nice kind of table. As we scroll over the table, you can see we get some hover effect, which is always nice. And this is my favorite feature. So as you scroll over a brewery that's represented on the map, and you can see, if you look on the map, we've got these custom markers. I'm going to show you how to make those, so that's really exciting. So as you scroll over a brewery, its location gets enlarged. So this beer glass, which represents the location of a brewery, gets enlarged. So what's really interesting about that is the way that events are handled. So we're handling a hover event, we're updating something on a map, so there's quite a lot going on there. But I think you'll find, as we go through the tutorial, you'll realize the power of Vue and just how easy it makes it for us to create an application like this. And when you think about it, if you had to manage all of this complexity, and programming pretty much is just about managing complexity, especially when it comes to creating non-trivial applications. So when it comes to managing this complexity, and if you had to do it just using standard JavaScript, it becomes very difficult. There's a lot to think about. You've got to update the HTML, you've got to listen for events. Vue handles all of that for us, and it does it in a very elegant way. So now I want to dive in and start programming this from scratch. But before we get going, there are some software prerequisites, and I really would like it if you followed along with me. So it's important you make sure you have a few bits of software installed before we get going. So first and foremost, you are going to need to install Node.js. So as you can see, it is just a binary executable that you download and run. It couldn't be simpler to install. So if you haven't already got Node.js installed, make sure you do that now. The reason why we need to install Node.js is because we will be using the npm package manager, so the Node package manager, in order to manage dependencies for our project. So if I just pull up a terminal window very quickly, skip this version, and clear down my terminal window and type in npm, as you can see, I have the npm command line tool available to me. And you get that through installing Node, so it's pretty simple. And then finally, there's one more thing that we need to install, and that is the Vue CLI, so the Vue command line interface. So what this does is it provides a command line tool for us that allows us to easily and quickly create Vue apps, and it puts in place all the scaffolding so we can get going really quickly. And in order to install that, you're going to actually use the Node package manager, which hopefully you've installed previously or you already have installed, and you're just going to run this command in your terminal window. Sometimes if you're on a Mac, you have to type in sudo before you run that command. If you're on Windows, it should be fine. But you're just going to run that command, and once you've done that, and once it's installed, and I'll just clear down the terminal, you should be able to have access to this Vue tool. And that's hugely useful. So we've got all these commands that we can use, and specifically we're going to use create in order to create an application. So they're the prerequisites. Once you've got those installed, we are now ready to go. We're ready to get cooking and making this application. So please do follow along with me. There's a lot to go over, but I think if you just concentrate and work hard on this tutorial, you'll be absolutely fine. Okay, so we're now ready to dive in and create our first Vue application. So the first thing I need to do is tell the Vue CLI to create a new app for me, and I need to name that app, which I'm going to call Brew, which is fitting as we are making a breweries list, so that makes sense. We just need the default settings, so just press enter to go through the default settings. So while that's loading, it is going to create an application for us within a Brew directory, and I want to open that directory in my IDE of choice, which for me is WebStorm. So let's just open up that directory. So I'm going to go to my desktop and I'm going to open the Brew directory. So as you can see, it's already started setting files up for me. At this stage, it's probably still running. As you can see, it's still running. So we can't actually run our app yet, but it's probably good enough for me to talk you through some of the files. First thing I'm going to do is set my IDE up though, so I'm going to just have the terminal window down the bottom here. I'm going to clear that down, and I'm going to use this to run my application once it's built. Aha, it is now built, successfully created new project Brew, and we can run yarn serve. You can also run npm serve, which we're going to be using today. Let's come back to here. Cool. So let's just very quickly look through these folders. So we have a Node modules folder, which is going to contain our dependencies, so our Node libraries. These are documented in the package.json file. So you can see at the moment, the only production dependency is Vue. Everything else is dev dependencies. These also have a number of scripts that we can use in here. So I'm going to run these scripts. You just run npm run, and I am going to run serve, which serves up my Vue application. So I'm going to do that now. So npm run serve. Also of note, in here you have the public directory. Within there you just have a single index.html file. This is a single page application. So by its very nature, we only need a single page. So what happens is when this application is built, whether it be in production or development, our JavaScript is injected. So our JavaScript is injected into this HTML page, and it is Webpack that takes care of that. So the Vue CLI is in effect an abstraction on top of Webpack. It makes the config seamless and easy. We don't even have to worry about it, but it is there behind the scenes. Okay, so you can update some things on here. So you don't have to have a title as Brew. You can say my awesome app. So let's have a look at what my awesome app looks like. So I've run npm run build, and it has served my app up on a local server. And here it is. Welcome to your first Vue application. So let's just unpack how this is actually displayed, and let's start making a few adjustments so we can begin with making our application. So the first point of note is the main entry point to your entire application is main.js. Main.js imports Vue from the node modules file. It then imports a Vue component. So all Vue applications are made up of components, and the root component is going to be app.vue. So notice that's in the same file as main.js. And to import in JavaScript something that is in the same file, I denote that import with a ./. So ./ means look in the existing directory. If we just say import Vue from Vue, that's going to automatically by default look in the node modules. So this sets up some config stuff, and most importantly, it sets up our Vue instance, and it mounts that instance to an HTML element with an ID of app. So if we come back to index.html and we scroll down, we can see there is indeed a div with an ID of app where our entire Vue application gets mounted to. So we will never need to change that. Okay, so let's take a look at our main root component, app.vue. So all components within Vue are made up of three parts. So we have a template. This controls the visuals of our page. We then have a script which contains the functionality, and it exports this default object. So this is, if you like, the component instance. And it is just a standard JavaScript object literal. So object literals consist of name value pairs. So here we have the first name value pair, which happens to be called name, and it names our component. So as a minimum, we need this in order to create a Vue component. Next, we have this components property, which lists the other components that we're going to use within this component. So with Vue, you get this situation where components can call in other components. The components they call in are child components of this app.vue, which is the parent component. So you get this kind of tree hierarchy. And then finally, we have styles, which are specific styles for our component. Now, this may look a little bit strange, specifically if you're coming from more of a traditional HTML and JavaScript background, where it's very common to separate concerns. However, the idea here is we have discrete components that sit largely in a standalone nature, and in effect act as small applications within a larger application. So what this allows us to do is create these discrete bits of logic that are simple and kind of compose themselves together to form bigger applications. So our bigger applications can be broken down into lots of smaller applications, which is really nice and is a very effective way at managing complexity. So let's take a look. What's going on here? Perhaps you haven't seen Hello World HTML tag before. That's because this is a Vue component. So you can see I'm importing Hello World from here. I then can use this component, so I can mount this component or bind this component to the template by calling it. I can pass in an attribute here, welcome to your Vue JS app, and we can consume that attribute as a property on the Hello World component. All of my components, apart from this one here, the root component, are going to live in a components directory. So you're already seeing we can nicely separate parts of our application into these kind of discrete blocks, and they can live in different areas, and we can be quite organized as we go along. So as our app starts to grow, being able to separate files out and place them in different folders is really handy. So notice we have again this ./. So the ./ says I want to look in the current directory. I then want to look in the components folder, and there should be a Hello World Vue file there. Which I'm going to import, and I am going to assign it. So I'm going to assign an instance of that component to this Hello World variable here. And because all components have a single default export, we can name this variable whatever we like. However, it's considered good practice to name it the same name as the file that contains the component. So hello world and hello world. So let's just dive into this component and have a look at what's going on. So I've already gone over the sections of the component. The only other thing I want to show you here is this. So we have this handlebars notation. So this is a placeholder for the value message. So let's just get rid of all of this stuff here. And let's just have a quick look at what's in message. So if I say hello, notice how I can easily combine just standard HTML along with some placeholder value. I don't know what that is, so let's have a quick look. So it's saying hello. The actual message itself is saying welcome to your Vue JS app. So where is that information coming from? Well, it so happens that information or that value is coming from a parent component. So you can see here we have this props property on the export for the component, and we're saying this component can receive a property called message, and it's going to be a string. So we can give it a value. We don't have to give it a value, by the way, or a type even. So this is a type, not a value. So it's of type string, but sometimes it's considered good practice to do that. So let's just have a look at what we're passing down. So this is how properties are consumed. So we have this attribute on the component tag where we're calling the component. We have this attribute message, which is defined here. Within there, we're passing in this string, welcome to your Vue JS app, and we can access that message using this handlebar notation. So Vue takes care of that binding for us. We don't have to worry about binding values from the component into its own template. Vue does all of that for us. So that's quite nice, and that's one of the ways that we can pass information amongst components. Okay, so we're ready now to get going and making our application, but before we do so, there are a couple of dependencies that we need to install. So the first is Twitter Bootstrap. This is what we're going to use to make our website lay out nicely. Maybe you know it's a CSS framework. So all we have to say is npm install Bootstrap, and we can install multiple dependencies at the same time. So we're also going to need to use Axios, which is an HTTP library. We're going to use that to consume the API, and we're going to save those dependencies into our package.json file. While that's installing, I'm going to rename. I think this has crashed actually. While this is installing though, I'm going to try and rename, if I can do it. There we go. I can do it now. So I'm going to rename this component to brew. I don't want to call it hello world anymore. So I'm going to refactor that. I'm going to rename it to brew. There's a couple of things we need to do. So remember, each component has a name. I no longer want to call this hello world. It's going to be called brew. And then within app.vue, I'm going to be importing now brew. And I'm going to update this variable to brew. And finally, I have to update the tag in the template to brew. And that should be okay. So import brew from brew.vue, and I'm using brew there. That's fine. And I have to tell the component also that it is indeed using brew. And if I come back now to my application, it still renders. It's absolutely fine. Nothing really has changed apart from the name. So I'm also just going to get rid of this logo. We don't need it anymore. I can also get rid of this property here. So we don't need that anymore. And in fact, let's just clear this down. And I'm just going to say h1, welcome to my brew app. Bang. Okay, so we've still got a few dependencies installing. Whilst this is going on, I'm going to bring another terminal window up. And there's also some dev dependencies that we need to install. So I don't know if you know, but in my package.json, I have dependencies that I need from our application, and then I have dependencies that I only need in development. So we want to use Sass. Sass does the Sass modules for compiling Sass into CSS aren't installed out the bat, but we don't have to do any further configuration. We literally just have to install. So we have to run npm install node Sass, and we also have to install the Sass loader, and then -- save, and then we're going to save that to our dev dependencies. Okay, so I'm now going to do a little bit of structure into my application. I want to have a directory called Sass. Within there, I'm going to have a main.scss file. In fact, on hindsight, I think I should call this SCSS. And within there, I'm going to have one called custom.scss. And notice how I have this underscore. So this is basically a partial Sass file. All of my partial Sass files are denoted with an underscore. It's just a good naming convention. And they will be tied together by my main.scss file. So let's just create that. There we go. So that's created. I'm just going to check that my dependencies have installed, which they have. I can also check in the package.json that I now have node Sass and the Sass loader installed. So that's great. So let's open up custom.scss and I'm going to show you now something which I think is quite amazing, and just how easy it is when we're using a build package to import a dependency such as Bootstrap. So now Bootstrap, I'm just going to go to the website actually and show you guys quickly. Failed to compile. Let's have a look at what's going on here. So it's saying no such file or directory. So let's very quickly see if we can fix this. End of no such file. So I'm assuming it's struggling. Oh, I know what it's doing. Come back to here. So let's come back to package.json. So sometimes you have these little problems. So let's just double check what we're doing here. So we're importing components, and we do indeed have that component there. So sometimes when you're setting up an app, it goes a little bit funny. So let's just see what we've got here. So let's stop our dev server. So all I need to do is Control C, clear that down, and run npm run serve again. And let's just see what happens. See if that rebuilds. Sometimes I can fix things. And yeah, that looks better. That looks like it's fixed it now. So that's weird. Sometimes that can happen when you're just setting things up to start with. I don't often see that happen when you're actually midway through development. So all you need to do to get out of this dev server is press Control C, and then you can rerun it. Okay, so where were we? I've kind of lost track. So we are in custom CSS, and we need to import Bootstrap, which is a CSS and JavaScript framework really to control visuals. So let's have a look at Bootstrap 4. So you can read through the introduction here. So if we just look at the dependencies that Bootstrap has, there you can see that there are some JavaScript dependencies. We don't want to actually use any JavaScript, any Bootstrap JavaScript that is. As you can see, Bootstrap has a dependency of jQuery. We don't want to mix jQuery up with Vue. So we're not actually going to rely on any of the Bootstrap jQuery. Instead, we're just going to use the CSS. Now we could just copy this link here and insert it directly into index.html and insert that up here. So that's one way of installing it. But what I actually want to do is install the Sass version of Bootstrap. This way we can modify it easily. So to do that, I've set up custom_custom.scss, and I can use this. So I can say import ellipson, and then I'm going to look in the Bootstrap folder within my node modules, and then I want to look in SCSS, and I want to import Bootstrap from there. So I'm importing bootstrap.scss, and then I just need to import custom. So I sometimes get these imports mixed up actually. So it's got an app before it. So I'm going to import custom into here. And notice I can omit the underscore there. And then I need to import I need to import main into my application. And I'm going to do it in the main entry point to my application, main.js. And check this out. This is really nice. So far, you've just seen me import JavaScript to my application. But I can also do this. I can omit the variable name because I don't need a variable name here. And I can say, grab for me out of the SCSS directory, main.scss. And if all has gone well, it should pull it in for me. So let's just check that has indeed happened. So my awesome app. So you're not going to see too much, but you can see the font typeface has changed there. The nice thing about using Sass is I could change any variable I like. Let's have a look where the variables are. I'll show you where the variables are actually. It's probably easier if I just show you. So if I go to node modules and I go to Bootstrap, and let's see if I go to distribution, if I go to Sass even, and I bring up the variables, double click on variables here. Any one of these variables I can override. So you see this default, this is almost like a fallback value. So let's say, for instance, let's look at body. So I want to change the body color. I could do this, and I'll show you. I wonder if this will work. So I could do this. Body color, black. Save that. Come back to my app, and nothing at all has happened. What's going on here? Let's just have a look at the variables here. Oh, it's body BG, I believe. Let's see if body BG. Body color is the text. Body BG, I assume, is the background color. So let's try this out. Let's try this out. Black. There we go. So you can see instantly I've updated the look and feel of my app. So you can modify all of those variables. I don't often use Bootstrap, but there's things like primary, secondary, tertiary colors. You can indefinitely modify Bootstrap to fit your needs. So quite often you don't even have to write any of your own SCSS or CSS, which is really nice. Okay, so that's done. So let's get rid of that. And that is pretty much all we need to do. So we are now ready to start building our application. So do make sure you got to this stage. Also, think about how playing around with some of the Bootstrap variables, have a little play around with changing some things in the app. But we're now ready to go, and we're going to dive in the next section, and we're going to install, we're not going to install, we've already installed Axios, but we're going to consume the Breweries API, so that's going to be really interesting. Okay, so before we consume the API, let's think a little bit about how our application is going to be laid out. So remember, we have imported Bootstrap, the Bootstrap Sass library, so we can use all of those powerful layout features. So first thing I'm going to do is within app.vue, I'm going to wrap my entire application, which is currently wrapped in a div with an ID of app. I'm going to wrap that in a container fluid. And it's going to be a class. So class container fluid. And this wraps my entire application. I can also give app level styles here as well. And also remember, we have a main.sass file where we could also put app level styles. Cool. But for now, I'm just going to delete these styles here because I don't need them right now. Next, I'm going to open up brew.vue. And notice here, I forgot to update the name. So I'm going to update the name of this component to brew. That was a slight oversight, so do update that. I'm going to come up to the template here. I'm going to remove the H1 here. And I'm going to remove this div as well. So I've got a container fluid wrapping the entire application. I'm then going to set up another container here, and I'm going to be using Emmet which is the browser snippet plugin, which you can download. It's just going to speed things up a little bit for me. So I want a container. Within the container, I want a row, and I'm going to close that off with a comment. Sorry, it's .row. So that's set up a container, and it's also set up a row for me. Within the row, I want a div, which is going to take up all 12 columns of our grid. So that's going to be a col 12 grid. Oh my lord, I can't type this morning. And we're going to have an H1, and we're just going to call it breweries list for now. Cool. And what's really nice about Bootstrap is it gives us the option to have a class, and all we have to do to align our text center is this text center. So let's just check out that this is all working. So it is indeed. So coming back here, we have our breweries list, and it's aligned to the center. Let's add a different style to it. So I'm going to say text. You've got text info here, and that changes the color. So it looks a little nicer. You can explore the documentation for Bootstrap to see what you can apply. Okay, so I've got the col 12, I've got my heading that goes right across the top. I've got this container here. Beneath this, I want another row. Within this row, I want 2 columns. So one column on the left and one column on the right. So the column on the left is going to hold a list of my breweries, and the column on the right is going to hold my map that we're going to implement later. So remember, a row is 12 columns in total. So this means you should be now kind of understanding that we want a div col 6, and we want 2 of those divs. And we want 2 of those divs. There we go. Okay, so for now, let's just put in here H2 left and an H2 right. Okay, so let's save that and check that it is all okay. So yeah, we've got this on the left and right. We could say text center here, class text center, just so we know what's going on. Let's just see if that updates. Left, right, hasn't updated. Let's see what's happening here. So div class col 6. I see what's happening. So we're missing the hyphen there, or the. So now that should work. Okay, now it works. So we've got the left and we've got the right. So this is our basic layout. We also need some styling to place each brewery in. So Twitter Bootstrap comes with a lot of components. The one I'm interested in is the cards. So you can search them here. And we're going to place each brewery in its own card. There's lots of different cards that you can use, and you can just paste this straight into your template. But we are going to use this kind of list group here, which is fine for us. So I can get rid of this now. I don't need this anymore. So I don't need this H2 anymore. So let's paste this list group in. I'm also going to want to apply some custom styling to this list group. So I'm going to add a CSS class called brew list to my col 6. And let's just check that that laid out properly. My awesome app. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. You would have noticed in the demonstration of the app at the beginning, we had this hover effect. So the final thing we need to do before we put in the breweries is set up that hover effect on the brew list. So let's go ahead and do that now. So coming down to my styles down the bottom here, I want to get rid of these existing styles, and I want to tell Vue that I'm using CSS. Now you don't need to use CSS technically in your components. I just want to show you how it can be used. In fact, most of the time, SAS. You don't always need to use SAS. The reason being is our components are very compartmentalized anyway, so there's not a huge amount of benefit, but I want to just show you how it can be used. So I have to attach this language attribute, lang equals SAS, SCSS, to my style tag. I can now use SCSS, and everybody should be fairly familiar with that. So brew list is a class I set up. I'm going to set up a few things. Firstly, I want the overflow Y to be a scroll bar. So I don't want the list to get increasingly long. There we go. Finally done it. I want the height to be basically the full screen, and I'm going to use the view height measurement. So 100 will be full screen, 95 would be 95% of the screen. So that's pretty handy. And then within the brew list, we have these list items. We could add a class to them, but I'm just going to say within the brew list we have list items, and we want to attach a hover effect to them. So we use the CSS pseudo class hover, and we will set the background color to dark gray. Cool. So let's just check that has updated. There we go. So we won't see the scroll yet because we've not got enough items in the list, but this is not going to take up more than a whole screen, and it's going to allow me to scroll down when I've got many breweries in the list. So that is looking good. So that's our CSS styling done. So let's now pull in our breweries. Okay, so we are now ready to consume our breweries API and display our breweries in that nice list that we have created. So if you go to openbrewerydb.org, there is this free API that you can use where you can grab a list of American breweries by querying this API endpoint. Now, in order to construct a GET request, you can literally paste it into your browser. So when a browser client visits a website, it issues a GET request. So this should work. So you can see here, I get a list of breweries returned. You can see the breweries are within an array. So this is what we want to work with within our application. So I've copied the API endpoint. I'm going to come back here to my application. For now, I'm just going to put a comment in and paste it in here just below my script tag. So let's consider what we need to do. So we need to, at some point, make a call to the breweries API. We then need to assign the resulting data to the component, and we need to display that component within our template. Sorry, we need to display that data rather within our template. So how would we go about doing that? Well, firstly, recall earlier, we could pass information into our application via this idea of props. So information can be passed down from a parent component to a child component via this idea of props. So props are passed down to components by parent components. We do not want any we don't want any props for this particular component, at the moment at least. There is also another feature of Vue components called data attributes, and they look like this. So data returns a JavaScript object literal, and hopefully you remember an object literal just looks like this. It could be this, it could be name equals Joe. So it's literally just a name value pair, and this gets returned from our data function. So this is a data property, and it has attached to it an anonymous function that gets returned, and I could do something like this: message hello world. And within our template, we can access these data items in the same way that we would access props. So it's the double moustache styling, and then it's message. And then we also have one called name. And as you can see here, hello world, Joe. So we have these data items that we can attach to our component, and I like to look at them as a way to kind of explain what our component's going to look like. So it describes what's known as, in JavaScript, the state of our component. What state can it have? What information can exist within it? So obviously, we don't need name, we don't need message, I can get rid of those. But what we will need is a list of breweries. And the breweries are going to be represented as an array. That's how we represent lists within JavaScript. So we are going to set up a list of breweries, and they are going to be empty to begin with because we don't have any breweries yet. We have not consumed the API. Okay, so we've got an empty list currently of breweries, but how do we populate that? So at some point, when the component is loaded, we need to query the API and assign the returning data to this array here. Now, Vue has a number of what are known as lifecycle hooks. Lifestyle hooks are hooks that you can hook onto, as they sound like. So you could hook onto them and you could run a function when certain events happen in a component lifecycle. So I've got them up here. So there's different types of hooks, such as before update, updated, before mount. But what we want is mounted. So this is when the component has mounted. So I'll show you how we hook onto that. So this is really useful. It's really useful to know that these lifecycle hooks exist. You can also check out the lifecycle diagram to see the lifecycle of a component, and you can hook onto any stage of that lifecycle, which is really nice. And this is how we do it. So we're going to say when the app is mounted, we want a function to run, and for now, it's just going to log to the console mounted. Okay, so this seems like the perfect place when the console is successfully mounted to make our API call. So let's pull up developer tools, check our console, and indeed it has mounted. There is some warnings that we've got here. That's not too much of a problem right now. We can sort those out later on. Cool. So we have our function mounted, and this is where we're going to make our API call. Before we do that, we need to import our API library, or our HTTP library rather. So we're going to import Axios from Axios, and you should have installed this earlier. And we have our URL that we're going to query up here. So Axios really simplifies the process of making HTTP requests. We could just say axios.get to construct a GET request. If you want to just construct a POST request, you could do that. So axios.get, and then we're going to pass it in our URL there. This returns a promise, which allows me then to call a then method on the returning promise. So you could look up promises, but they're a way to deal with async requests. Now you might think you could do something like this. This.brews equals axios.get. That won't work because Axios returns a promise. It doesn't return a resolved promise with data. So to resolve the promise, you have to run the then method on the promise, and this takes in an anonymous function. And I can use the ECMAScript 6 big arrow function for this to make things a little bit more elegant. So this takes in an anonymous function, which passes the data into a parameter on that function, and we're going to use R to represent the data. So let's just do console.log R. Let's see what we get here. What's this actually saying? Property name is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. Okay, so that's probably reference at the top there. We can have a look at that up here. So we need to get rid of these. So you see that Vue's basically saying we're referencing name and message, but it doesn't exist on the properties or the data of that class. So let's get rid of that. Okay, so here is the response from Axios. So as you can see, it doesn't just pass back the raw data. The raw data does exist on the data property. It also hands back things like headers and some request information, things like status. It was a successful status, so 200 is successful. So we just want to access the data part of that result. And there we go. Now we have access to just the data, and we can see we have 19 elements in our array there. So we have 19 breweries, and you can have a look at the breweries. And you have things like brewery type, you have the city that it's in, country, you have things like state, which is the state it's in. So these are all bits of information. You have a website URL. So these are all bits of information that you can access. Just before we go ahead and display this on our list, I just want to show you this. So the application is compiled down to a single JavaScript file. So I'll show you very quickly. So if I go to network, you can see this single JavaScript file app.js is loaded in. But when we're in development mode, we have this source map, and the source map maps parts of that single file back to our original pieces of our application. So if I click here, brew.vue, you can see it doesn't just pull up the big app.js file, which is massive, and it is there. It brings up a representation of my individual component. So that's super handy for debugging. I could do things like this. I could place a debugger tag in there, and I can do stuff like this. Refresh the page. As you can see, it now stops here. So that's super handy for debugging. Once I'm in this part of the program, R is within scope, so I can have a look at what's in the breweries. How do I map through those breweries? So I can really experiment with my application nicely. Okay, so let's come back to our code. So remember, we set up this data item brews, and we can access it from within our component like this.brews. And it's going to equal r.data. Okay, so we now should be able to display our breweries on the screen. So for now, I'm just going to dump them here. And we do it like this. So let's check that this has laid out. This is quite interesting. So I still got this breakpoint in. You can see breweries are there, but they're initiated currently to the empty array because this request has not finalized yet. So let's see when that does come through. If I can just continue through. Remove that. So let's try and remove this, and let's refresh the screen. Interesting. So we've got a bug. Breweries are not getting assigned to this .brews. So let's have a look. Okay, so you can see I've got a typo here. So I said this .brew when it should be this .brews. There we go. So I now have this array list of breweries. This isn't obviously the nicest display, so I want a way of displaying this on my HTML template that obviously resembles a Bootstrap card for each brewery. Now we need a way of iterating through a list, and luckily Vue comes with a number of what's known as directives. So directives are a way of dynamically manipulating the DOM and displaying data based on the state of the component. So there's a whole list of directives that you can use. So you have custom directives and also directives that you can use. Things like VIF, and this can react to a data attribute called scene, and it shows this text if scene resolves to true. But we want to use one called for, which I don't know is in here. So for is another directive, which I'll just search for up here. v4. By the way, the search on the Vue documentation is fantastic. I don't know if you remember back in the day when you used to search on websites, you could pretty much guarantee this search bar would return nothing useful. But Vue actually uses an Elasticsearch implementation called Algolia, which is actually you can access for free. And it is really well organized and intuitive. So this is exactly what we want. We want this v4, so it allows us to iterate through the properties of a object. So it looks like this. It allows me to set up a for loop that you're probably familiar with through programming. But what's really nice about this is the for loop exists within our HTML. So let's have a look at how we would do this. So if you think about it, when we iterate through, we want to set up a separate list item for each brewery. So I'm just going to have a single list item to begin with. I'm going to place the class down here, and this is just the opening and closing section of the opening tag. I like to lay things out like this because it makes my life a little bit easier. Okay, so this is what we need to do. We need to say v4 brew in brews. So this could be anything, but it is just a singular representation of each item in our list of breweries. So v4 brew in brews. Okay, so this is fine. Then we can access each individual brewery like this. So for now, I'm just going to print to the screen each brewery, and we'll check that it is working. Okay, so we get this instance here. And remember, I've got this scrollable feature. But that is fine. But we don't want all this information. All we want is the brewery name and the brewery state. So we have access to the brewery name, and we also have access to the state, which is here, Alabama, this one. Okay, so brew.name. And just look how easy this is. If you were to do this in JavaScript, pure JavaScript that is, it will be a little bit harder, I think. Brew.state. And I'm separating that by a colon. So anything outside of these curly brackets is just standard HTML that you're all familiar with. That's fine. That's much better. Cool. That's looking good. I'm going to get rid of this. So I copied this in from Bootstrap. Style width 18 rem. I don't want that. I want this to take up the entire 6 columns. So I'm going to get rid of that. And just lay this out a little bit. Much better. Okay, so we have a slight issue. We have a complaint here. So it's saying element iteration is expected to have a vbind key. So lots of different frameworks like this require some sort of key in order to track each list item. I don't want to rely on the IDs that the brewery has passed back to me. So what I can do is I can tell Vue to track for me the index of each brewery. And let's just see what this does. I'm going to place the index here. So I enclose the opening part of this argument within parentheses, and I place in a second argument called index. And I'm just going to show you what this is. So you can see it is actually just the array position. So if I go right click, inspect, and I've installed the Vue browser extension, which is really handy. You guys should install it. It's a free Chrome extension. And I click on breweries. You can see 0 is my first brewery, which corresponds to this, which is the index. And within it, I have this Avondale brewing. So that's what this is what that does. So it allows us to set up an index, and that will be useful later on. And then we can solve this problem. So what's it asking us to do? It's saying vbind key. Okay, that's fine. So we can do this. So we can do vbind key equals index. And that solves that issue. And this is also your first introduction to vbind. We can bind various bits of data to HTML elements and Vue directives, and we use the vbind to do it. We can also lop off the vbind and just use the shorthand double dot, which we'll be using in future. Okay, so that's it. Just to clarify what's going on before we wrap up this part of the tutorial, we are waiting for the component to mount. When the component has mounted, we are making an Axios call to the Open Brewery DB. We are assigning the results of that call to a data property that we've defined on our component called brews. We are then using the v4 directive here to iterate for our breweries, and then we display each brewery within a contact card or a card. And in order to track that, and later on down the line, you'll see how this is useful, we are assigning an index and binding that index to our v4 directive using the bind property here. We could also do vbind, but this is the shorthand version. Cool. So that's that wrapped up. In the next session, we are going to refactor this a little bit, and then we are going to start looking at our mapping. Okay, before we go about integrating the map into our application, I think at this stage it's worth us refactoring our application so far. So refactoring is the process of going through and tidying up your code and, more importantly, making the architecture of our application better. So I'm just going to come across here to the Vue JS documentation. So there's this whole article on organizing components that you can have a look at. And it's showing here a typical app infrastructure architecture even, where we have this root component. So this is app.vue. You have subcomponents here, and then subcomponents going to have their own child components as well. So at the moment, we've only got this one root component, which is app.vue, and then our brews component here, which is going to get very large, which we don't want. So it makes sense at this stage to think, okay, so the list can live in a separate component by itself, and the map can also live in a separate component by themselves. They kind of require their own distinct functionalities. And in that way, we are reducing the complexity of our brews component. So our brews component, rather than think about display logic, literally just lays out the kind of larger look of our application. So let's go ahead and do that. So you can see brews list is being displayed in this card. I don't want to control the column size within a subcomponent. I think the parent component should do that. So we need to move this class down to here, and we need to check that that doesn't affect our layout or our hover, which it doesn't. So I then want to get rid of this chunk of code, and I'm going to copy it and delete it. and I want to place it in a brew list component that will be inserted here. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that. Now I have a snippet installed on WebStorm, which allows me to create a component, a Vue component, but you can just create one manually. That's absolutely fine. Brew list. So this is automatically called brewlist.vue. Has a template, and in this template we are going to paste in the code that was originally in our brew component. So we've got our components called brew list. You notice I made a typo there. I've put the list, the I as a capital I in list. So I'm just going to refactor and rechange that there. So the component is always named the same as the file. So I need to update that. Okay. Let's see what we've got here. So we need to import this brew list component so we can actually use it. So we need to say import brew list from current directory brewlist.vue. I'm going to put .vue on the end there. Next, we need to grab the styling that was applied to the Vue list, which was applied to the list of breweries within this component. That list is no longer here, so these styles become redundant. So we can take them out, and we're going to place them in brew list here. And remember, you have to set the language equal to SCSS. If you are using Sass, that is. I'm just going to lay that out correctly there. We now can, within breweries or within brews.vue, we can use the brew list, and we're going to place it here. And it looks like this. I just use a self-closing tag there. Okay, so already things are starting to look a little bit cleaner. I've removed a whole chunk of logic from within my application. But let's see if this actually works. So coming back to here, we've got an issue here. Okay, I see what happens here. It's saying I've done the import twice. I didn't actually even notice it. Oh yes, here we go. Let's get rid of that there. Okay. Okay, so our list, as you can see, is loading in, but there's no data. So let's have a quick look at what's happening here. So we've got this loop here, which is trying to access brews. However, a child component cannot access data on a parent component. And this is really good practice because a child component needs to be decoupled as much as possible from its parent component. We need to be able to move this around our application easily. It shouldn't be tightly tied to the parent component. So we need to pass data down, and this is quite common. So you've got this idea of a component tree in Vue, and data gets passed from parent components down to child components. And generally speaking, we normally have a one-way flow of data. So we have a one-way flow of data from the parent down to the child. And that's considered good practice, and it creates these loosely coupled components which we can move around and place wherever we like in this application, or indeed any other application that we go on to make. So how do we pass information down? So one of the ways of doing this is by using this props component, which you've seen briefly before. This takes an object, and then it takes a list of properties within that object. So we are going to take one called brews, and we can assign a type to it. So it is type checked of array. So this can now receive brews. So it can now receive brews in the form of a property, and we have to pass it in from the parent component. Now, because we are dynamically grabbing the value of breweries, so we're dynamically grabbing that from the API on mount and assigning it to our brew component, we need to use the vbind to pass the property in, which looks like this, vbind brews. And we can omit the vbind and just use the shorthand notation, which is exactly the same, and then we can pass in brews. So let's just check. So brews are our data item. They are populated by this API call, this.brews equals r.data. We are then passing brews in to the property of brew list, which is consumed by using this props attribute here, and we've defined on it a bruise property, which is going to be of type array. So a fair bit going on there, but hopefully it makes sense. If not, just go back and forth and have a look at how this relationship works between the two components. So let's have a look. So we now have our breweries list back. So finally, we need another component. So it will make sense to have our map in its own separate component, and we're going to put it on the right hand side. So insert map here. So let's go ahead and create that in the same way that we created our brew list. We are going to create a brew map, and this will be called, I need to go, no, I'm going to just remove that there, delete that there. I need to do a new Vue component, and it's going to be called brew map. And that is created there as brewmap.vue. For now, I'm not going to place a map in there. I'm just going to have a div with a h2 in it, and I'm going to call that map. Okay, there we go. That's fine for now. I'm not going to take in any properties yet. We'll pass in some properties later on, and then I'm just going to import and use that. Brew map from brew map.vue. And then I can use it up here. So brew map. Don't know why it came up with that. Some weirdness is going on here where it's duplicating this. I don't know why that's happening, but let's get rid of that and just check that our map does indeed come in. And our map component is now included into our breweries component. So to summarize, we have our breweries component, and then we have two subcomponents, a brew list and a brew map. Those subcomponents are known as child components, and we can pass, as we've seen in this component here, data down from the parent to the child component. So let's now go ahead and probably do the most complex part of this application, but believe me, it's not too scary. We are going to set up the map itself. Right, so we are now ready to add the map to our application. So we are going to be using Leaflet, which is a JavaScript mapping library, which is built on top of OpenStreetMap, which provides mapping data for free. The thing is, though, we want a way of combining Leaflet with our Vue application, so we are going to use a Vue plugin called Vue to Maps, which I'm going to pull up here. Sorry, it's called Vue to Leaflet, rather, and it's a npm package called Vue to Leaflet. It seems reasonably popular, and it's built on top of the Leaflet library, and it allows us to easily bind Leaflet to our Vue application instance. So looking here, we've got documentation, so we'll go to the documentation, and let's click the quick start guide here, which seems like a good place to start. Okay, so firstly it says install Vue to Leaflet, and this will automatically install as well the dependencies of this library, which are going to be Leaflet as one. So it's going to install the Leaflet library for us as well. Okay, so npm install Vue to Leaflet -- save. So while that's going on, let's just go down and see what we can do. So we do not want to use it system-wide. We only want to use it on a local component. So it's saying we have to import this into our local component. But firstly, it's saying in the entry point here, main.js, we have to import L from Vue to Leaflet. So this is effectively the Leaflet library, and we also have to import the CSS. So let's do that. So I'm going to open up main.js, which is here. And I'm just going to see where that imports. I'm going to import that right at the top above my Vue application. I think that's fine. Okay, let's see what we need to do next. It looks like there's some issue with the library. To resolve this issue, we need to do this. So it looks like there's something with the icons. I don't know 100% what that is, but let's paste it in. Bang. So I've pasted that in there. That should be fine. Let's just see what we need to do now. Cool. Okay. So I noticed that there was a JS Fiddle example on the npm package page here. So it says JS Fiddle. If you want to hack around here with JS Fiddle, click here to get started. Okay, so this seems to work. So let's see what we've got here. So there's a data component here. So we're just going to grab these. Before we do that, we need to import these elements or these components into our R component. So let's go, and I'm going to open this up in a new tab here. Then I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to go back to the documentation. Go back to the quick start guide, and it tells me how to import those elements here. So I'm going to do that. So import lmap, ltire, lmarker from Vue Leaflet, and notice it's within these curly brackets. These are not default exports, they're singular exports, and I'm importing each one, so I can import any part of the library that I need, which is really nice. So let's go back to brew.map and let's import them. Remember, I also have to tell the component it's using other components. So I'm going to do that here. Okay, so let's look at what else we need to do. So we need to describe the state of our component. And we remember, we do that using this data function that is going to return. You need to make sure you put a comma here to separate the name value pairs. It is going to return an object literal. And let's see what values it's going to have on it. It's going to have these values here. A point of note, notice how these guys have omitted this bit here, and they've just called the function data. So this is kind of shorthand. It's a shorthand way of achieving this. I actually like using a shorthand way, but I just thought for the sake of verboseness and understandability, we'll just do it this way. But that's exactly the same as this. Okay, so we've got some various data attributes here. We have zoom, center, URL, attribution, and marker. So they're the map attributes that we need. The URL is a URL to a tile mapping service. At the moment, we're just using OpenStreetMap, but later on we'll update that to a better provider. Cool, okay, so let's just see what we need to do. Right, so we need to insert the map here. So lmap is our component that we're importing from the Vue Leaflet library. So let's just paste that in. Before I do that, I want to tidy this up a little bit. So I want to set up a div.row, and I'm going to apply a map class to it there as well. Just do this here. Down here, I want to set up map to a view height of 95, just so it takes up the page. Within here, I'm going to have my map, and that should work. Fingers crossed. I always get this kind of gut feeling it's not going to work, so let's have a look. I'll be amazed if it does actually work first time. And it works first time. So we have our map here. So that's awesome. So we've pulled in our map. It's rendering this single marker. So how is this marker picked up? So the marker is here. So we have this L marker. And you can see we're dynamically assigning to it values. So we have here, and I'll show you actually how it works. So we have the L library that we've imported globally, which you can see we've imported it here. and this just creates a latitude and longitude for us. And then our marker again has a latitude and longitude, and we can play around with things like this. So we can have, oh, let's see, zoom 20, what does that look like? I have no idea. Zooms in a little bit more. So this mapping library is fairly detailed, but we want something a little bit more sophisticated. So that's what we're updating in the next part, and we will also start adding our breweries to the map. Okay, so my understanding of mapping is OpenStreetMap provides the geodata. We then have a tile provider, which is denoted by this URL here. So at the moment we're using OpenStreetMap. Now it's not advisable to use this tile provider for anything but the most simple of testing. So let's grab a better tile provider. So if I go to Google and I Google for Leaflet JS, it's going to bring up the Leaflet library. So this is in fact the library we're using, but we've got this Vue plugin that's sitting on top of it, which helps us integrate it nicely into our application. Let's click on tutorials and quick start guide. If I scroll down, there is a list of tile providers down the bottom here, and I am going to be using Thunderforest. I've tried a couple of these. I've tried Mapbox. I found Thunderforest is the easiest to get working. So let's just click on that. You're gonna need to create a new account, but I'm just gonna log in. There we go. So I've logged in, and it provides me with a API key down here. And more importantly, it provides me with some tile URLs. And I'm just gonna use transport. But there are different types of map renderings that I can assign just by changing these URLs. I guess it's a little bit of a strange concept. So I just paste the URL into here. There we go. So I've got my API key there, and then the URL here. So when you set up an account, you have access to this straight away. It's pretty straightforward. So let's come back to my app. I should see a slightly different rendering now. So the rendering has changed, although it's not entirely obvious, but you can see it's now black, and it's over France, but I have these like transport type, I have these roads, which is quite nice. As you can see, I can see the roads in a bit more detail. Let's see what other types of maps we have. So you could change it to Pioneer. I have no idea what that is, but let's have a look at what it is. So you can play around with all of this as well. So let's see what this might look like. So as you can see, we've got a completely different rendering of our map. So you can play around with different renderings and just see what those tile layers look like. But for now, I think transport is fine for our needs. Okay, so that is all set up. We have our tile provider. We're using Thunderforest. We're now ready to pass in the breweries so we can display them on our map. Okay, so we're ready to feed our breweries into our map so we can display their location. So if you recall, the breweries are actually consumed via an API which is referenced in brew.vue. So in the mount function, we are using Axios to get hold of the breweries, and we're assigning them to the brew component. And you can see here, this.brews is going to equal to the resulting data of this API call. So you maybe remember, we're already passing this data down to the brew list. So it goes without saying, we need to do the same with map. So brews. So you're really seeing now how data filters down through components. So brews is going to equal brews. And then I'm going to open up my brew map, and I have to add that as a property. So here's my component declaration. I'm going to add here props, and I'm going to add to it brews, and this is going to be of type array. Excellent. So I now should be able to access this on the component template. So if I type brews here, I can see that my breweries do indeed come up, and they're feeding down from my brew component. So you can see here, as you know, this is an array of breweries, so we can iterate through this. You've already seen us do that here. But we're going to need to access this here, the latitude and longitude, but this isn't necessarily in the format that we want it. So at the moment we've got this marker here, and we're passing in the latitude and longitude in this marker property. And you can see here, or down here rather, we're using this L library in order to set the latitude and longitude in a leaflet format. In case you're wondering where L is coming from, here is our L library, and it is basically the Vue 2 leaflet library, and it's exposing this function on leaflet that formats the latitude and longitude for us so it can be displayed on a map. So we want to have access, so if I come back to brew map, we want to have access to this on our template when we iterate through the breweries in order to format the latitude and longitude. So whenever we want to interact with a function from within our template, we need to set up what's known as a method, and it looks like this. So I'm going to come down here. So after components, I'm going to have an attribute called methods, and these are methods that I can easily interact with from within my template. So I'm going to make one called lat long, and this is going to be a function that takes in the latitude and longitude, and it is simply going to return l.lat long, lat, and longitude. So all this really is a wrapper around the lat long function that is available to us via this Vue 2 library. So I'm exposing it to the template, and this is what this method does here. Okay, so let's come up to the top here. So we've already got this marker here, but I want to turn this into a loop that loops through all the breweries. So I'm just going to do that now. So you remember we've used a loop before, and I'm going to make this just a little easier to read because there's a few bits of information we need to put in here. So what I'm going to do is I am going to set up a v4 brew in brews. So that's going to loop through my breweries, and I'm also going to set up an index. So remember, the index just tracks the array position, and I'm just going to vbind the key. So I'm going to vbind the key, and I'm going to make that index, and that's just to stop us from getting an error, and the key is what we use to track the loop. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. So before, you saw us put information within the loop, and that would make sense if you're from a programming background. So we're doing things like this, brew.name, and we're replacing that kind of within the loop. However, you can also place information from within each brew instance within kind of the opening loop HTML tag, if that makes sense, so within L marker. So what we want to do is we want to set the latitude and longitude, but remember, it is on brews. In fact, firstly, we need to actually call our function down here. So our lat long function, which we have access to, lat long, and then I have to pass in my latitude first. So I'm going to say brew dot latitude. What's that saying there? And brew dot longitude. I think that's how you spell it. Let me double check. I don't think that's how you spell it actually. Longitude. So there we go. Let's just paste that in there. And let me just make sure I spelled latitude right. I don't do much mapping, so I think I've spelt it wrong. Yes, I have spelt it wrong. There we go. That looks a little bit better. Okay, so let's get rid of brews from up here and just check that our markers do display on the map and we don't get any errors. So I'm just going to inspect just to check that I've got nothing. I've got some errors coming out of the console here. Let's see what we have here. I don't know what that is. Cannot read property lat of null. Okay, so let's just double check. Let's see what's happening here. So I'm going to zoom right out because remember, all of our breweries are in America. Okay, so yes, they are being added to the map. So that's interesting, right? So I don't know what that error is. They're probably errors that were there before. So we'll keep an eye on that. So my breweries are being displayed on the map, which is awesome. So the reason why, if you remember, I called it the Arizona breweries list is because while there are breweries across the country, the vast majority are in these two locations. So one is Arizona, and I don't know where even that is. Where is this? The other is, there's a few in Alabama, there's some in Arkansas, but the vast majority seem to be in Arizona. I don't know why. I don't know if there's a good beer scene there. So what we want to do is we want to just filter the Arizona breweries. And then what we also want to do is focus the map just on Arizona. And then finally, we're going to add in our map markers to turn them from these kind of blue markers into beers. So into beer custom map markers. So hopefully you've got this displaying now. And then the next part of this, we're going to filter them so we just see Arizona breweries. And then finally, we're going to add our custom map markers. And we're also going to add this really nice functionality when you hover over a brewery, its specific marker increases in size. So let's get that done in the next section. Okay, so we want a way where we're going to filter out the breweries that we get back from the API, so they just include those breweries that are in Arizona. Now, as we're using this component type architecture, it's very easy for us to do this. And what's more is these changes will update throughout our application. So the maps then will receive a filtered list of breweries, and the breweries list will also receive a filtered list of breweries. I'm just going to show you how we do this. So down here we are getting data from the API, and we can use this ECMAScript 6 filter function, and it looks like this, and it takes in another function which is going to set the filtering criteria. So this is in effect going to iterate through every element in our array, and it allows us to make a comparison based on some condition in here. And I'm going to use ECMAScript 6 function, and I'm going to use it on a single line. So this is an arrow function. I'm going to use it on a single line. So it immediately returns whatever value I place to the right of the arrow. And we're going to say r.state equals Arizona. And this is just a shorthand function that you can look up. So we're saying r.state equals Arizona, and that should filter our breweries list. And as you can see now, we only have breweries that are in Arizona. So to see how quick that is, and that updates across our application. So our map at the moment is currently hovering over France. We do not want that, of course, so we need some way of recording the latitude and longitude, displaying it to the screen, and then having a decent starting position. So I'll show you how we do that now in maps. So we're going to go to brew map, and you can see here we have a center and we have a zoom, and we want to track when that changes. And what we can use is we can use the update event in Vue. So we can say this at update zoom, and then we can run a method on our controller, which we haven't defined yet, or on our component even, that we haven't defined yet, called zoom update. And then we're going to have at update, and you've probably guessed, center equals center update. We don't need that. And then we can display up here in an H2 center is, and I'm going to create a property called current center, and zoom is current zoom. So what this will do here is whenever this changes, so whenever the zoom property changes on this component, it will fire this callback, and the callback is linked to a function called zoom update and center update. So we just need to define those, and we also need to define the data attributes current center and current zoom. So I'll do that down here first. So current center, to start with, it's going to be obviously the same as the default center. Current zoom is, to start with, going to be 20, which is the same as the existing zoom. Okay, so let's define our methods. So current center. In fact, it's actually called center update, and it's going to take in a function with center in it. So this actually passes in center. Art of manuless updates. That's interesting. And it's going to set this dot current center equal to center. And we need to do the same thing for zoom update. And this is going to pass in the zoom. And we just simply need to set this to this dot current zoom equal to zoom. So this is really cool. So this has application beyond what I'm showing you now. There's probably simpler ways of doing this, but this has application because if you think about it, being able to react to events and update the state of our controller based on those events is quite powerful. So you could do things like if someone zooms over a certain area on a map, you could show them further bits of information. You could grab the weather about that area, some news about that area. So you can kind of pull in different bits of data based on actions that happen. So that in itself is very powerful. So I think we've done everything we need to do now. So we should be able to see where the current center and current zoom is. So let's check out our map. Cool. This seems to be working. So you can see that updates as I move across my latitude and longitude also changes. So let's just zoom to the position that we want the map in. So we want it over Arizona. That's about fine. So about there looks good to me. So we have latitude and longitude, which we can now grab from here. And let's place it into here. And I'm also going to update current center. And zoom is going to be 6. Excellent. So we can get rid of this now. We only had it there for testing purposes. And I also wanted to introduce to you the power of these event listeners. So we can look at properties changing on components and we can react based on those components. So let's check out what this looks like. That looks like the wrong location to me. Hold on, flag stuff. We just need to adjust the zoom outward a little bit, I think. I don't know why that is. Let's make that 10. Okay. Let's pull the zoom back up here and just see what's going on. Remind me tomorrow. Okay, so zoom is 18 there. Interesting. Zoom out. So it looks like we're in the right latitude and longitude. Zoom is 6. That looks right to me. So current zoom, let's just check what we're doing. So zoom is here. Zoom here. So let's check that's okay. So current zoom. I know what I've done. I haven't set it there. I set current zoom, but I haven't set zoom. So zoom is a property that gets passed into the map, and that should be okay now. So let's check that is okay. Aha! It's now working. So you probably saw me make that mistake and you've already corrected it by now. So now we can get rid of this. Okay, so I'll save that. And we're now going to do our very final thing, which is change the map marker and finally do the hover over and change the map marker size based on that. So the final few things we're going to do, so we're nearly there. Well done if you've got this far. Okay, so we're now ready to create our custom map markers. So the first thing that I have done when this video wasn't running is I searched on the internet and I found this rather touching beer.png icon. So you can find your own icon, and I just placed it in this assets folder here. The next thing I want to do is I want to update the map with my custom markers. So in order to do that, I am going to import the L-icon component even. So the L-icon component from the Vue to Leaflet library. I need to make sure that I tell this existing component that it is indeed going to be using the L-icon component, otherwise it will not work. So I'm just going to do that there. Next thing I need to do is I need to import my beer image. So I'm going to do that now, and it's going to look like this. So import, and I'm going to call it beer. Because I'm using Webpack, I can import non-JavaScript assets into my application, which is very nice. So I'm going to import beer from assets, and it is called beer.png. I'm then going to attach a few properties to my data object here. The first one is going to be my icon, which is going to be beer that we just imported, and I'm going to have an icon size. And to start with, we're going to give it an array of 15 by 15 pixels. Excellent. Now we just need to use the L-icon component within our marker here, and it looks like this. L-icon, you can see it's available to us, and we need to bind to it the icon size, which is going to be icon, which is going to icon size, which is going to equal icon size. And also we need to bind to it the icon URL, which is going to equal icon. Okay, and that should be URL there. And if we just scroll down here, again, just to remind you, we have the icon, which is beer, which gets bound to the icon URL, and then we have the icon size, which is just this array. So that should work. So let's refresh our browser and have a look. Boom. So as you can see, we now have our beers instead of our standard map markers. So that's really nice. That's a really nice touch. The final thing we want to do is when we hover over this, when we hover over a brewery corresponding to a specific location, we want the beer to become bigger. So we want the icon size to adjust based on an event happening in another component. So the final part, that's what we'll do, and then we finish this tutorial. Okay, so we finally come to the part where we need to enlarge these markers based on a hover event occurring on a brewery here. So let's think about what we've got here. So on the outside of our component here and here, we have the brews component, and the brews component is the parent component of brews list and also brew map, which is this component here. So far you've seen the parent component passing data down to brew list and brew map. So you have this one-way flow of data. However, we have not looked at how child components interact with parent components. And the best way to do this is to emit an event. So we don't directly bind data from our child to our parent component. Instead, we broadcast an event, and our parent component can hook onto that event. but the child component doesn't necessarily know the state of the parent component or really care. All it cares about is a hover event has occurred. I'm just going to broadcast that, and anyone who wants to can then subscribe to that event. So it's quite a nice programming pattern. So I'm going to show you how we do that in Vue. So we need to come to our brews list here, and we need to add an event which will fire a function. So we're going to do this. So on each list item, I'm going to have a @mouse_over event, and I am going to run a method on the component called mouse_over, and I'm going to pass into it my index, so I know which brewery I have the mouse over. So I know which part. Sorry, not brewery. Index. There it is. So I haven't defined this method yet, so I'm going to get this error at the moment. And I also have an @mouse_leave event that Vue lets me bind to, and I'm going to call, you guessed it, mouse_leave, and I'm also going to pass in the index. So all we need to do is come down to our component, and we need to define some methods. And the first one is mouse_over, and this is a function which takes in an ID, which is the ID not of the brewery but of the array position. So this is going to take in fact, it's probably better to call it index. So it's going to take in an array index position, and to emit an event, all we're going to do is say this dot emit, and then we're going to name the event, which is going to be called mouse_brew, and I'm going to send the index with that event. Okay. Next, I am going to define the mouse_leave method. So I'm just going to do that now. And this is going to be a function. And it's also going to take in an index. And I'm just going to say this dot emit mouse left brew. And I need to put semicolons in there. Let's do that now and save that. Okay, so within my parent component, which is brew.vue, I'm going to bind to this event. So remember what the events are called: mouse_over_brew and mouse_left_brew. So within brew.vue, where I call the component, which is here, I can bind to the event @mouse_over_brew, and I can run a method, and I'm going to run the method mouse_over_brew, which I'm yet to define, and I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to say mouse_left_brew there, and mouse_left_brew there. So they're my two events. I now need to set up some methods that are going to run, which I shall do down here after our mounted function. So methods. So I'm going to say mouse_over_brew. And remember, it emits the index, which I can grab. For now, I'm just going to log the index to the screen. Console.log index to the screen. And I'm just going to add to this mouse_over, and then mouse_left_brew function, and again I'm just going to console dot log the index and mouse left for now. So we can do something a little bit more interesting later on. So let's just check that this actually works. Okay, so let's come back to our breweries list. Okay, that's interesting. So we can see the mouse over works, but the mouse left is undefined. So let's come back to our brew list. I think I know why this is. So you can see I'm not actually passing the index into this event here. So let's do that. Now this should not be undefined. So we're going to come back. And there we go. That is working now. Excellent. So the final thing we need to do is react to this event. And we need to pass down to the map component a different icon size when this happens. And that's what we'll do when we wrap up this tutorial in the next section. Okay, so what I want to happen now is whenever these events get fired, so we've hooked onto these events, whenever they get fired, we want to change the icon size of our breweries, or our breweries icons, if that's a better way to describe it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a data function on my brews. Sorry, I'm on the brews list. I need to be on brew.vue where I can assume it. So I'm consuming the event here. And what I need to do is, I've already got a data function set up there. So I need to set up a normal icon size. So my normal icon is going to be 1515. And my large icon for now is going to be 5050. So the first thing I need to do is I need to somehow attach the normal icons to my breweries list. So what I can do is I can use the map function when we grab the data. So let me just zoom out a little bit so you can see what's going on here. So we're already filtering the data just for breweries that exist in Arizona. What we can then do is run a further ECMAScript 6 function on this called map, which is going to do this. So it's going to map through our breweries. It's then going to add a attribute called icon size that doesn't currently exist, and it's going to add this .normal icon to it. So this .normal icon is our normal icon size, and then we want to return the entire record. So all we're doing here is we're iterating through our breweries and we're adding an icon size to our brewery record. So let's just double check that that does indeed do that. So let's go to my Vue browser plugin and app and check brew here. So I've got my breweries here. So I have 11 breweries. I'm just going to full screen this so you can see it a little bit better. Yep, and you can see now I have this icon size here. Okay, so instead of hard coding in brew.map.vue, so instead of hard coding my icon size into the icon, I am going to do it dynamically. So icon size is now going to become brew.icon size. And that shouldn't change anything here. So everything's still working. Okay. Now let's see how we can react to our mouse going over a brewery. So recall we actually get a index through. So what I can do is something like this. So I can say this dot breweries. So this dot brews. I can pass the index in to my array position here, and then I can say dot icon size is going to equal. So when the mouse is over it, it's going to equal this dot large icon. Okay, so when the mouse is over it, it's going to equal this dot large icon. And I'm going to do the opposite of this when the mouse leaves it. So I'm going to say, let's paste this on here. And this is going to be this dot normal icon, which is what I called it. Okay, so just watch how amazing this is. So hopefully this works. And you'll notice that all of my components update when the master component that is passing the data down amends its data. So that change propagates across all of my components. And as you can see, it is working. So I'll just close that. So you can see as we scroll over those breweries, the right one enlarges, which is excellent. That's really nice. So this pretty much ties up our application. So let's just very quickly go over the finer points of this. So breweries is pulling in information, it's pulling in data from the Brews API. We're then running a filter on that to filter just for breweries in Arizona. We then run a map on those filtered results and we add to it this icon size. So we add to each brewery an icon size. So this is what this does here. And that feeds down to two components, which are child components that we can see here. Where are our components? Brew. So our two components that we're using are here. So brew map and brew list. And brew map dynamically updates when we update the icon size within this component here. And brew list communicates back up to us via these callback functions here. Not callback functions, sorry, event listeners. And we bind the event listener functions here. As you can see, I'm saying when this event fires, run this method on this component. So that pretty much ties up the tutorial. We've covered quite a lot of stuff there. There's a lot to learn. I imagine you're going to have to go back and forth and change things around. Also, I just want to guide you in the direction of the Vue 2 Leaflet website, Vue 2 Leaflet. So this is the plugin that we were using for maps, for mapping. So you can go obviously to their website to get us going with their tutorial, but I found the most useful learning that I did was within their Git repository. If you go to source, components, there's a number of, not here, if we go to back, if we go to source examples even, and then we go to source within here, components, there's a number of different examples here that are actually demonstrated on their website. So you can look at them on their website and then come here and you can find out how to implement them within your application. So definitely do that. So I wish you the best of luck and hopefully you found this tutorial useful.